Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us here tonight. We're delighted to be convening for this discussion about how we can harness the power of AI for public benefit. My name's Jess Montgomery. I'm Director of AI at CAM, which is Cambridge University's mission on AI for science and society. And I'm really pleased to be joined here tonight by my esteemed panel, who I will ask to introduce themselves in a moment. So we're at a moment where we're hearing a lot in the news about the use of AI in public services and its potential to transform the productivity and effectiveness of those services. Tonight is an opportunity to dive into how we might deliver that vision and how we can make sure that AI technologies really connect to public benefit. So before I start, I'm just going to say a few words of housekeeping. We are not expecting any fire alarms tonight, so if an alarm does go off, please be guided by the festival team to the appropriate exit, which will be straight ahead the way you came in. We are also recording the event tonight, so please keep that in mind. Later on, we will have some time for audience questions. That will also be recorded as part of the event. So perhaps to start, could I ask each of our panelists just to briefly introduce themselves and who you are and where you come from?
Yeah, I'm Neil Lawrence. I'm a professor of machine learning at the University of Cambridge.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm Liz Watts, and I'm Chief Executive of South Cambridgeshire District Council.
I'm Tom Smith. I'm the Director of AI at the Ministry for Housing, Local Government and Communities in Government.
Good evening. I'm Robert Pollock. I'm the Chief Executive of Cambridge City Council.
And so our discussion tonight is about the use of AI in public services, and we've heard a lot about the use of AI in different parts of government. Could I ask each panellist to start with some reflections on where have you seen benefits from the use of AI, either for residents or for staff? And have there been any surprises about your experiences with AI in government? Robert, could I start with you?
Okay. I think it's too early to answer that question. I think Liz has got a couple of good examples I hope she'll talk about. I think we've been testing AI in a relatively controlled environment. I think the big challenge is to get people more excited and curious about it. We were recently one of the signatories, along with lots of local companies who are the leaders and at the cutting edge of AI in Cambridge, also the University of Cambridge. In fact, the document that you coordinated, which I think was really helped to propel interest locally in Cambridge about the role of AI in public services. It prompted us to have an internal discussion about the policy. And I think there are some concerns, as well as the opportunities, around making sure this technology is safe, secure, it's used ethically, that the compute power requires a lot of energy. So how can we bring a sustainability element? But we now do have a large language model at an enterprise level across the council. We're setting up some AI clubs. We're testing something called Magic Notes, which is almost a productivity tool to help caseworkers deal with more complex housing or benefit cases, frees up their time. So at the moment, we're really using it as augmenting job roles. We're over the summer going to be looking at how we can automate more processes, which I think would be really good. But I do think and it's great to see so many people here. I think there's a big role for all public sector organisations to encourage the public to get curious about AI in their own lives and in the workplace too.
We're all using AI quite regularly. So I've come up from the train. I used Google Search to get here, Google Maps to get here. That's an optimization. It uses similar kind of approaches to some of the things that people are excited about right now. We will have phones that we're taking pictures on that are recognizing faces, that are changing kind of settings. So there are things that we're using day to day already. And I think this is the interest right now is there are tools and products and services and techniques that really feel and look like they have value for local government and national government services, so public services, in the way that we all kind of engage with them. We've just sort of heard a couple of examples of things, but I think it's really early days. I agree on this. Examples of, say, adult social care caseworkers, like the Magic Notes, All of those are being tested and some interesting results coming out, time savings and so on. There's lots of good stuff like that. In central government, we have a suite of tools which are called Redbox, Minute, Consult. They do the sorts of things that if you know what ministers do and carry around red boxes full of papers, you can imagine what those sorts of AI tools are there to help. They help sort of summarise what's in the red box tonight. There's a lot of papers. Where's my kind of 1 minute digest so I can then work out what to look at first. So there were some good examples, but it is really early days. However, we've rolled out Copilot and other examples that are available, but we've rolled out Copilot in lots of organisations in pilots and trials. You're saving about 30 minutes a person a day. That's a big saving if you're thinking about government budgets are tight. That's a big saving if you're thinking about working new things, new policy areas and programmes. So those sorts of things kind of have a lot of impact when you scale up to 500,000 national civil servants, or the size of the health service, or the numbers of people working on adult social care and so on. So there were some really big examples. There was something about what excited me, and this is one of the examples. It's not in government, but Boston Consulting Group, who are a bunch of consultants, ran various trials on consultants using large language models like Copilot and ChatGPT versus consultants not allowed to use. They then just got on with their day jobs doing what consultants do. And they found kind of a number of things out after this trial. First up, kind of speed saving, so more work coming out, quantity. That's probably sort of obvious. The quality of the work also went up. And that's kind of not obvious. And that's quite an interesting one. It's sort of the idea of how you use Copilot. The thing that surprised me is how interesting it is in terms of generating ideas and creativity. But the thing that I kind of got most excited about was the biggest benefits were for people, the lowest performers. So it wasn't just the high flyers and the top performers who were using this sort of tool and thinking, getting on with it. It was people who were maybe kind of struggling a bit or had too much on, and it was helping bring them up. And if you went round to a bunch of local authority chief execs like in the room, or people running businesses and said, I've got a way of improving the productivity of the half of your team who are below average or not doing so well, that's brilliant. I've spent all my life looking at how you measure and model deprivation and poverty, thinking about areas that are left behind, ways and tools that can kind of help groups that are struggling. That's great. So that's the sort of thing that's exciting me about it.
I'll talk about one example of what we're doing in the council, and I imagine for lots of residents here, you will have commented on our local plan when we go out to consultation. So in 2019, we went out for our first consultation, and we received about 20,000 comments. And I know, because I sat next to two of the people who did this, that it took them about 6 months to input those comments and to organise them and to analyse them. And that was a really slow process. And, you know, I imagine as members of the public, you were thinking, what has happened to my response to this consultation? Is anybody looking at it? Is anybody doing anything with it? So we have a number of stages of consultation. The next stage is in the autumn. And between 2019 and now, with funding support from central government, from my friend here, we have built a large language model for our planning consultation. Neil and the university were involved, and we've been involved with another university, Liverpool, as well, in building the large language model, so that when we go out to consultation in the autumn, rather than a couple of people taking 6 months to review all of the comments, that will all happen automatically. It's pretty much at the push of a button. What won't happen is any decisions will be made. But what will happen is that we'll take 6 months less time to be able to say, this is what the public have told us. And then we as humans in the organisation, led by our politicians, will make decisions on the future of the local plan. So that's a fairly kind of significant time saving, cost saving, but also I think better service for the customer, so that people can see what is happening. What are you doing with my feedback?
I mean, I'm not at the coalface of deploying these things as my colleagues here are, but I think what excites me about it is a chance to refresh the conversation. I think that there's no doubt this is a transformational technology that in 15 years' time, we'll look back on the way we're doing things now, and it will look kind of as ridiculous as it looks when we look back 80 years at the way people used to do things. But I think there's no doubt, if we look at, let's say, the last 40 years at least, we've had an increasing problem where humans are being increasingly removed from the decision-making processes. And, my favorite commentator on this is Baroness Honora O'Neill, who in the 2002 Reith Lectures talked about the substitution of human judgment with process. And we see that in the Horizon scandal, where you've got computer systems making errors and isolating the professionals who should be protecting the vulnerable people, the lawyers, the accountants, the sub-postmasters, the civil administrators, from that decision-making and disempowering them. And so in some sense, when people talk about dystopia, we are sort of in a weird dystopia now, where when people are trying to make decisions at the local level, they're isolated from the decision-making system because it's become digitized in the name of efficiency, which is in general a good thing, but it can also undermine the bespoke nature of these solutions. And some of the things I'm very excited about is the potential, if we do this well. I mean, if we do this badly, make no mistake, it could get much worse. But if we do this well, and by doing it well means coming together, central government, local government, universities, local companies, large companies, and understanding the nature of the problem and building solutions that put the humans back in the loop, that improve our ability to protect our citizens and to identify when vulnerable people are being harmed, and make the world a more human place. And I find that incredibly exciting. And one of the things about this latest wave of technology and the work Liz has done with South Cambridgeshire is they have this amazing AI club where people who traditionally wouldn't be so interested in this technology are engaging and are keen to do the right thing, aware that there are risks, but keen to do the right thing.
So can we take that question of how do we do this well as a jumping off point for discussion? Because the applications of AI you've talked about so far, they're about how our local communities are designed. They're about how we look after vulnerable local residents. If we're a worker using AI, our experience of life at work. These are all areas that really have an impact on us personally, as well as a community and economically. So how do you make sure AI tools are used responsibly in public services?
People often say Cambridge is a really successful place, but there's inequality. And one of the things that City Council really does care a lot about, particularly our politicians, is the digital divide. There are people who the City Council interacts with who don't use smartphones and computers, and it's really important they get the services and support they need. And I think one concern I have is there the potential for everyone who has access to this great technology to go off in one direction and exacerbate what is a digital divide. So we currently fund, and there's a lot of great charities locally doing work. Cambridge Online is one of them. There's the CAMS Youth Forum. And so I think AI is another type of digital technology. So in whatever happens going forward, I think there's a really important role to make sure it's as inclusive as possible. And while it's not technically AI, it's machine learning. We've got Professor of Machine Learning here who can explain the difference. This idea of inequality, particularly for young people who are furthest from the labour market, is a real thing in Cambridge for those who don't have access to some of the high-tech jobs. And there's through lots of pilots and working with private sector companies who use technology platforms, we pulled together an idea called Region of Learning, and it's all about trying to promote digital badges. So if you're a young person and maybe you're not in formal education, you can take lots of digital badges, and the platform helps you to point out, based on your use of your phone, for example, what digital badges you might like to do. And sometimes it's just volunteering, it's learning basic professional skills. We've got lots of employers like Marshalls, like some of the local biomedical and tech companies that have signed up, the police, the City Council. You can take a number of these badges, they're all approved by City and Guild. It uses a bit of basic machine learning, but you can connect young people who may want a job, but may not not feel connected to the labour market. 2, real opportunities. So I'd love to see AI. We've talked a lot about improving the productivity of our organisations. I'd like to see how AI can help solve, not in itself, because it's just a technology, but help other humans to live better lives.
Anybody else like to jump in?
Sure. So another project that we've got is in our contact centre, which is where people phone us up for lots of different reasons. And so we've introduced AI there, first with web chat, and we've just moved to voice. And in setting it up, we did a lot of consultation with the public to understand what was important to them and to make sure that we were doing it in a way that was sensitive to people's needs. But I guess the thing for me is that you always need to keep on top of that. So last week, a lady complained to me that she'd reached the contact centre and it was our busiest week because we'd just sent out 100,000 council tax bills. So it was a really busy week in the contact centre and she had to wait a long time. And when she was answered by AI, it said, what service do you want? Now, I've got probably 20 people in the contact centre and each of them will be trained in different things. So if you want to talk about council tax, you'll go through to a certain group of people. If you want to talk about something else, you go to a different group of people. Not everybody's trained in everything. So she said bereavement because her husband had just died. And we hadn't trained our AI to recognise bereavement. So she sat in a queue until she got to a general advisor. And she wrote to me and she said, that's not okay. If somebody's bereaved, they should get straight through to the next person. And she was absolutely right. And so, it was really easy within a day to reprogram the system so that if somebody says bereavement, they go straight through. They jump the queue effectively because they're in a state, a really vulnerable state. But I think the thing about AI is that you can sort of implement something and think, right, you're done, dusted, you fix that problem, move on to the next thing. But actually it's about, continually sort of monitoring and learning and making sure that what you're doing is sensitive to the needs of your customers.
Can I sort of build on that? I mean, that's so important. And I think one of the problems with digital technologies that we have so far is they isolate us from that. And the model that we have of providing these technologies is like a one-size-fits-all model. I mean, if you think about, imagine that with clothing, that there were like 4 companies that sold all clothing and they just gave you one size sweatshirt and we all had to wander around wearing that sweatshirt, whatever the occasion was. Yeah. I feel that some of us would love it. And that's kind of where we are at with digital technologies. And we've kind of got used to it and had to adapt to it because, of course, humans are incredibly adaptable. But in this type of position, it's incredibly frustrating for people when they immediately recognize the depth of that problem. They want to bring their humanity to the problem. And then, for example, imagine a case where they're unable to change that. That's just in the system, that's part of the service. And if you want to change that, that's 100,000 on your contract. And that's where we are with most of our digital provision. Just the nature of digital technologies is isolating for most people. You have to be a software engineer or something to sort of change these things. But the incredibly exciting thing about this wave of technology is it has the potential to put that right. And I want to be really careful about saying that potential, because if it's badly deployed, or if we're not consistently listening to voices and examples like this, and what Robert's saying about equality in the community, everything will just get done by the cheapest solution, the one-size-fits-all solution, and these problems will potentially be made worse. And that's why I think it's so important to be having conversations like this and to be working across the boundaries.
I'll add in as well. I mean, there's a part of government called the Government Digital Service, or GDS, which probably launched in about 2010, sort of first round. And it's just had a bit of a reboot to include and build on AI. But one of their big sort of phrases was do the hard work so that it's better and easier for users. And that's the kind of, it's sort of Liz's example. You need to keep understanding what are citizens trying to do with this service. Does it work for them? And that's a digital kind of approach, and digital product teams in industry, in government are kind of very much attuned to that, aware of that. And if any of you kind of updated your passport, renewed your passport recently, you'll have seen actually it's pretty good. It works pretty well. If you've gone and rented a car abroad and got the kind of, the sort of printout, again, it's pretty good. It can contact a lot of different services, some in industry and so on. So there's a lot of work that goes into that to make it a bit seamless. So one of the things about hiding that, but then there's a ton of stuff under the bonnet, which we want to understand as public servants what is happening there. And that kind of comes around to the point on lock-ins and so on. And my big area is around data and data flows. So you need to be able to have the data that feeds into services, that underpins services, reusable. So taking a local example, in my area, down in Brighton, we still have lamppost notices on planning applications. It's 2025, that's mad. And so, but there is a lot of, it's difficult to move from that into a system where all planning applications on are reusable across the country, that if I want to go and find out in this area, if you want to find out what's happening in your area, and industry can build tools to make that easier, and public services and local government and so on can build tools to make that easier. So you need that kind of underground, that flow and that sort of ingredient and sort of stuff to power these systems. So that's, again, we need to work really hard to avoid any kind of lock-in where data ends up owned by one part of the system or one type of vendor and not reusable elsewhere. So that's an example of how we've got to get it right.
Can I add some colour to that? On the government digital service, how many here have done COVID tests online or done their taxes online or any of these services here? When you're looking at the interface that you're using, and I worked at Amazon for 3 years, those interfaces are far better than any interface Amazon is offering. It works well for my mum, it works well for me. If you talk to international students, they're sort of shocked about how good and efficient it is. That was all the work of the government digital service. And it's incredibly hard work because you're catering for such a diverse population, trying to make a form that is as readable to me as it is to an older person or a younger person. But it's proof positive that, well, I think government did that really well. You may have different experiences.
Mm.
Could I pick up on the point about notices on lampposts? Because it connects to what Robert was talking about earlier in terms of those digital divides. We know that there are still a lot of people who don't have regular access to laptops or smartphones or the internet. Don't we still need the notices on lampposts or the equivalents in our public services?
Yes.
So how do we integrate that with our ambitions for AI?
I mean, I'm not sure I would do that, if I'm perfectly honest. I think people are entitled to know if something's happening in their street. They're entitled to know that without having to go and look for it. And so I'm with the notices on lampposts, which I think is the law, actually.
Yeah.
I think there are so many other things that we can go at in local government. It's not like that's the last bit of productivity we can save. So we have a crowded field of productivity problems to solve. So I'm with the lampposts.
Yeah, and actually that's making me think about place-based thinking. So actually today I cycled past a mobile library on Grange Road. And I happened to notice it because it had a mirror on the front, clearly to look down to see if there's a child in front of the vehicle. I presume. And I was just thinking about, as I was cycling into work, one of the challenges I think we face with modern structures is that we don't build community around information. When you think about library, when you think about City Hall, and the place-based nature. And I think that's another reason why I'm so interested in local government work, because we know that those communities, place-based communities, are sort of fundamental to thriving societies and better equity across the community. And I mean, that's the sort of fundamental challenge in your area, isn't it?
I mean, that's what we're all about in local government, is shaping places and supporting communities in their place to do the things, that help them kind of live kind of good, thriving lives with decent jobs and, nice places to play and all those sorts of things. So that's kind of our sort of greater principle, I suppose, how we do it and the tools that we can use to assist us. If, as you say, if I can get all 850 of my colleagues to spend half an hour less on admin every day, then they can spend half an hour more on, doing that kind of greater purpose stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we get to the challenges or opportunities for using AI that really resonate with people, that people really care about? What have you been doing to try and surface some of those kind of real resident interest issues locally?
First of all, you have to go out and ask people what they want, I think, and that's what's been missing so far, because I think as the public sector, we're still trying to understand what this is. It feels like it's a really good technology, but at the moment, there are a lot of cowboys trying to sell you what they think you could use it for. Until I think we're more confident in understanding how it can be used, then I think that there is some work to do in community centres, in lots of our touch points with local residents to understand what they want. You know, what would they like improved? And then, as Liz says, how can AI help solve that in a more effective, and ideally a cheaper way?
Neil, maybe could I come to you on the role of the university here, because Cambridge benefits from several world-class research institutes locally. Shouldn't we be doing more to help our local and national government colleagues as they deal with these challenges?
Yeah, I think, well, we're certainly very aware of that. And I think, so trying to just step back from the public decision-making, but the technology itself for a moment, and just sort of talk about what's going on here. We're talking about a total revolution in the way that we share information. We've already sort of seen that with the internet. It's kind of as if someone's just reinvented writing. And in our society today, we've settled into processes that are based around old ways of doing things. That we certainly don't want to throw those processes away. But you know, I have to say, the notion of artificial general intelligence is eugenic nonsense. It's as absurd as an artificial general vehicle, right? And I think it's appalling that we put so much time onto that notion that as if this can replace a human. But while that's absurd nonsense, don't mistake the fact that this technology is massively transformational, because for the first time, everyone in this room can talk to a computer in the English language and have the computer do the thing they want. Now, in the past, that's only been something that's accessible to software engineers, and even then, they have to work very hard to sort of think about how to get the computer to do it. So this is a massively transformational technology. Now, what does that mean? Well, I think I don't think universities are doing a good enough job. I mean, we can point finger at lots of institutions about where things are going wrong, but just trying to look after one's own patch. The role of universities in society has to be looking at, of course, there's academia, there's sort of like, you know, learning for the sake of learning. There's, you know, my colleagues that are just focused on some piece of history that they don't necessarily believe should have impact. But there has to be a role in there for us to be steering and supporting society to deal with these innovation challenges. And when you think that the University of Cambridge is, you know, a leading university in the country, then for my book, what leading means is we have to show the way forward and enable others to follow. And one of the things we've been looking at is the history of how over time universities can become more and more detached from their communities and their community problems. And you even see this today in civic universities that are specifically set up to support their cities. You know, when you think of like Birmingham and Manchester in the Industrial Revolution, in developing the type of people that they needed for the skills to solve the problems locally. Now, back in 1851, there was a royal commission that investigated why the universities of Oxford and Cambridge had done nothing to contribute to the Great Exhibition. Because all the stuff in the Great Exhibition was coming out of the civics. It was coming out of Manchester, Glasgow, Birmingham, or Germany. All the technological innovation was being done by the universities that were immersed in their communities and supporting their communities in delivery. Now, I would argue today that it's not just Oxford and Cambridge that you can criticize for that. I think it's the whole university ecosystem, and it's largely driven because our incentives are all, well, you should all be working to get things on the cover of Nature or talking about how many Nobel Prizes you have. Now, that's fine. You know, we have a lot of Nobel Prizes, according to the people on the Punting River, right? But what good does that do to the bus driver in Rotherham? Very little, actually. And they're becoming increasingly detached from technological innovation. So when it comes to what Robert was just saying about engaging with community and what they want, you know, we have convened at AI at CAM the Cambridge community and the Liverpool community and sat down and said, what problems would you like us to solve? Jess also led a process doing that for the Royal Society 10 years ago. And the public are consistent. They would like advances in education. They would like advances in healthcare. They would like advances in community decision-making, social care, security. they're very clear about this. And the one thing they were clear about 10 years ago they didn't want advances in was computers that could generate art. And the only thing we've made significant progress on is computers that could make art. And I think that's really disturbing. But it's because the problems we're dealing with here, the problems that Robert, Tom and Liz are faced with are so-called wicked problems. They're problems that have always existed. There is no easy resolution to how you allow a community of people to live together healthily and be educated together. They're the problems we should be putting most of our societal resources into. But in fact, what we're doing is putting a large amount of our societal resources into solving problems people didn't know they had, like looking at short videos of cats, which is great, but to an extent, we would like more of that resource to be steered. And, we will always have those things, computer games, new industries. We shouldn't suppress that. But we really need to get in a situation where we're steering more of that towards the fundamental problems of societies. And if universities aren't convening those conversations, there's absolutely no way universities can solve this on their own. But if universities are not convening those conversations, who is kind of the question. Mm.
To be fair, Neil and Jess are convening quite a number of local authorities next week to explore exactly these issues. So I think you should definitely take some credit for making that point, but trying to do something about it practically. So thank you.
And actually, the example I gave you of the contact centre came out of a conversation that one of my colleagues had with you probably about 18 months ago and sparked that idea of maybe we could do this here. So I think in Cambridge, there's a kind of growing movement understanding that, we are kind of offer a rich field of problems to solve in local government, and colleagues at the university can help us solve them. So it's quite a symbiotic relationship, really. It's very much a two-way relationship. And as Robert said, we're going across the whole of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough next week with about 70 people in the room with our kind of what are our joint challenges. And I think one of the things that it's really hard when you've kind of got your head down in an organisation is that you don't always have the headspace to think, okay, there's 5 other districts in Cambridgeshire and they've probably got their head down in the same problem that I've got my head down in. And, taking some time to talk about what would be one problem that jointly we could solve and, do it more efficiently and effectively by doing it together. And AI and Cam have been brilliant at convening that space.
And to add on to that, what's the role of central and national government in supporting and working with local authorities? I won't be as eloquent as Neil, but there's a huge amount of how do we build things, help deploy things, how do we invest and fund pilots, so the sorts of things that Liz and Robert have talked about, and how do we, what's our position, what's our role in terms of convening, working with academics, working with public sector, and then think about there are system problems, there are systemic problems and challenges. Central government is probably best placed to help unblock those. There are levers that we can help pull. So if those are legal barriers to, say, reusing data in good ways, if there are issues in terms of lock-in and vendors, etc., with running products, tools that essentially slow down innovation, then there are potentially things that we should be doing. So that's the kind of questions and conversation that we're looking at in supporting local government and AI work.
Mm. And that's an incredible point. I mean, it's one of the really interesting things when you convene these conversations. You're coming into it like, how can AI help? And then the first thing you find out is that there's a whole culture of suppliers basically offering services to local government, absorbing the data from local government, and then when local government want their data back, saying, oh, you didn't pay for API access, that's £500,000 more. And this type of simple support mechanism, because as Liz is saying, people have their heads down trying to get on with doing the job. There needs to be more communication across the people who are doing the purchasing. And these things emerge from these conversations as well. So you sort of convene people initially around this thought that, oh, we're going to learn how to use AI to fix everything. But very quickly, the conversation is really getting down to nuts and bolts and sharing knowledge across different councils about just how to deal with a supplier or what sort of things go wrong when dealing with not just AI suppliers, but regular digital suppliers as well. That sort of institutional knowledge that is so key to getting these things right.
So I'm going to come to audience questions in just a moment. So please start thinking about your questions for the panel. As people do, a final question from me. One of the messages that came through from our public dialogues in Cambridge and Liverpool was that people have a sense that AI is something being done to them, that they want to have a voice in AI development, that they want to be engaged in this discussion about the future of AI, but it's hard to know when to start, where to start, or how to start. So any tips for how people can engage in this conversation about our shared future with AI?
Well, I could speak from the perspective of my own colleagues. So 18 months ago, we set up AI Club. And everybody was invited, and it was 45 minutes over lunchtime. And the reason I set it up was because I'd read this article saying, if you don't understand AI, in 5 years' time, you probably won't have a job. And I felt a moral duty towards my colleagues to make sure that, that they do understand AI. And so we meet every 6 weeks. And initially it started off with 100 people, all feeling a little bit nervous about joining a Teams meeting and not really knowing what was going on. And now it's probably about 40 or 50 people every time. And people come with examples of what they've done. They come with problems. They come with... So today, for example, somebody who'd been there for all of the meetings said, I've got this question. I haven't really felt comfortable asking it before, but how can I make my job more efficient? And he described his job and everyone was like, oh, you just do this. And it was a sense of, oh, great. But I think the thing is that lots of us, myself included, we're not that technical. I don't consider myself a technical expert in any way. I realise I'm surrounded by people who are. But if we're all going to benefit from and understand and learn from and be able to live in a world of AI, we need to have safe spaces. And for my organisation, that's AI Club. I think what Robert said is equally important, that we need to be able to talk to residents about AI in a space that's safe for them, so that it's not a threatening space where people think they have to come as experts and know what they're talking about, because there's a whole load of jargon that I still don't understand. But actually, everybody's got views about the broad concepts and what matters to them, and I think that's really important.
I'm going to jump in on... very few experts know how to use AI. You might know about the algorithms and the kind of how this is built, but I'll be honest. When I sat down and started asking ChatGPT questions, it's kind of mind-blowing, and it might be wrong and it might be right, but just the conversation, the questions that you can ask and get back an interesting answer. And so when we've rolled out those sorts of tools in our organisation, there are just some prompts. You go to the thing and it says, here's some things that people are asking. And it's like, that's a brilliant idea. That would save me 10 minutes of digging something out of emails or going and looking on the web or going to find Jane who knows this stuff. And it's like, actually, you can ask this. And so the connection of the sort of being able to ask and speak to it in our language, in English or in any language that you like, but not just computer programming codes, that's a kind of transition, that's a transformation. So totally encourage, if you have not spent any time on this, go and ask it some stuff that you want to know. Like, what should I do at the weekend? What might the kids like to see on TV this month? I don't know. Just ask it some questions, get some ideas from it, and it was quite an interesting then sort of process to work through that. I find that kind of de-terrifies, de-risks that sort of engagement.
I really love Liz's story, because I think that's exactly what senior people in the public sector need to do, to kind of lead by example. So I'm only just creating an AI club following Liz's inspiration, but I suppose I was just really curious. What is this? Now I've got about 5 or 6 different large language models, and they each have different types of personalities, and I'm just really curious. And the more I'm curious, the more I learn, and then the more I think, oh, this could be really interesting here. Or my partner asks me really difficult questions and I just go, well, and I sound, but so I think I found uses for it in my personal life, but also in work. So this morning I I trained up a little AI agent to be a bit of a public policy geek and asked it some really difficult questions about children's social care, and spent a bit of time iterating it, and then got some decent output. It may not all be 100% correct, but by doing that myself in 10 minutes, I've not had to ask someone else to do it, and it could have taken them away from doing some really important work. So I'd just say be curious.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, I think you can do all this, and it's not a substitute for your human contacts and your human interactions. It's an enhancement. I mean, and if you haven't tried these things, I'd urge you to, and actually I should try and find a good resource for people that gives suggestions for people to start. Actually, maybe we should build one. But Eliza, damn. I think that the interesting challenge, when you hear about it, you think, well, is that not some sort of substitute for human relationship? But I think, as Robert was just sort of saying, if you can prepare yourself for going into a meeting by having a conversation about a subject area and let's be clear, it often gets things wrong. And it's a weird type of thing what's going on with generative AI, because it's just a distillation of everything like lots of humans have written, and humans get things wrong. But oddly, it will get things wrong in a different way the second time you ask it, which is very similar to humans. And actually, this is a characteristic you sort of want, because you want to know where the uncertainties are. So one of the things I will often do with it is I will start a new session and ask the same question again. So I'll go through some discussion, but we rat hole on something, I'll pull out and I'll go through again and do a different discussion, just to try and get the breadth of what opinion is and understanding. And I find it useful because it's giving me something. It's not personally invested, it's not emotionally invested, it's just giving me something, and it allows me to potentially stand back from the issue and think about it. But for that very same reason, it's also not useful, because it isn't personally invested, it isn't emotionally invested. So it can allow me to stand off a situation and think about maybe a work colleague and how I can improve my relationship with them. But I can't go back to it and sort of say, but you said this and you're responsible. No, it's not. I'm still responsible. I have to be responsible. And I think it's an amazing tool for improving the way you think about problems, but it's not a tool for devolving your responsibility for the decisions you make or for substituting that emotional connection you have with other humans.
Questions from the audience?
In government, I worked on AI, but also previously on smart cities. And it's kind of, I think that local government has come a really long way digitally in the last decade, with not a lot of help from central government, actually. But I just wonder, I bring out a bit what Neil was saying about, the appeal of using a machine learning model is that it improves, and it will also, you'll build up more data. And who owns the improvement? And I think there is a real question about how we make sure that the improvement, as you said, you can end up with a supplier owning the data, and that is not acceptable with a public service. But who owns the improvement? And do you think really that public and civic organisations will actually end up doing more in-house, because these things don't really fit a contracting out model? When you've really built up a sort of Cambridge local public data model, that's something, should that be owned by the city? Are you actually going to have to own it yourselves rather than contract out a service?
There's been a trend across the world, and we've had patches around the UK of these Office of Data Analytics. So I think AI might be a route for smaller organisations to get their data sorted. You've got to structure your data first, but I think you're right, it gives the potential to do that. But we'd have to make sure there are really strict guardrails around that, who has access to that data, that it's secure data. But I do think you're right that the scope for building things in-house could become a lot easier. That's my hope and aspiration. And I think the more we talk to AI at CAM, the more we learn about where the market might be going in future. So we have a digital strategy, to try and improve, and it's digital data and technology. So we're really keen to see how that can help us get there quicker, because if we can get there quicker, I think it can improve the services for residents, and that's why we're here.
Hello, I'm a professor of design and human behaviour. At the base of what we do with AI and machine learning, we're using the Michi model of behavior change in health to try and drive those Riddle-like wicked problems to one side and see if we can actually use the machine learning tools to help people change for the better. What worries me, and this is my question, I also live in Abbey Ward, which might as well be on the moon in this town. We are the least looked after. I think when we're talking about AI, we're a bit like finance. We're talking about quite a middle-class game where people won't even know the questions to ask or the interventions to make. I'm seriously worried about this because as researchers, and all of us have a long, I'm sure, research record in here, we're all conscious of unconscious bias. And I worry about the way this is being developed both in the city and elsewhere that is going to have the unconscious bias of the middle classes and others just baked in. And that's my worry. And it's not a worry that we haven't tested. I was talking to a US partner this afternoon, and they're worried, especially with what's happening in the US because the clown outfit is on out there. We have some serious problems with this if it gets baked in like this. So I think democracy, Plato's model of democracy is the tyranny of choice ends us in the end. I think we've got to work differently to do this. And in Australia, we developed a couple of models, including a sensing model to use AI. And there's nothing like this in the city. I live down a street where the speeds of cars must reach about 100 miles an hour someday. You don't need a policeman there because you never find one, but it'd be quite good to get some AI down there to see exactly what's happening in the behaviour around that. So my question is, how do you stop it getting baked in and we end up with what's happening with financing, that it's a middle-class game and the unconscious bias is really built in?
I can give a start on that. I mean, I think we're very conscious of that, and in some sense, it's not just a problem with AI. It's a problem with a large amount of digitization and the way the overall economy is working. I mean, I spent most of my career in Sheffield. As you go to the east there, the way people have been told, oh, you should train to go and work down a mine, and then all the mines are just shut. And one of the real dangers I think we have with AI is that we're having, and I think you see this definitely at a national level, you're having an extremely middle-class professional conversation around it. Because for the first time, middle-class professionals are seeing that the bits of their job that they thought were specific to them and could never be replaced are suddenly under just as much threat as those mine workers and steel workers' jobs. And one of the things that when we were doing Royal Society work that Jess was involved in convening, I felt very strongly on that just after the Brexit vote is when people were sort of saying, oh, well, I bet no one in this room voted for Brexit. And I was like, well, isn't that exactly the problem? That none of the people who feel those things were actually being given a voice. I'm deeply worried that we, instead of adjusting for that, we're going further in that direction by more central control and more central deployment, but much more steered towards the fears of the professionals. But we do know that the professionals are actually very capable of adapting and assimilating. So it won't be professional jobs. It will be the people on the margins of society already who are pushed further over those margins. That's what we see in the past. But that's exactly why a lot of our leadership with AI at CAM is, well, let's engage with those people who are having those problems. Let's do those public dialogues. One of the gentlemen in the public dialogue in Liverpool worked on the Land Rover production line. So I learned all sorts of things about how you cover the seats of a Land Rover. And getting those voices represented, because to be clear, they say much more sensible things than many of my colleagues do. And the problem is that somehow they get lost along the route, that it's not making a large amount of money to improve education or healthcare or these other things, but it is the sort of things that would improve people's lives. But I do think we've got extremely, I'm sitting next to 3 people who work in public service. There's not particularly great rewards for doing that in this country at the moment, and I think that's also something we have to shift. The conversation around what it means to be a public servant, I think, is in an appalling place. But if we address all those things, I think we can turn this around. But it has to be done partially from the bottom up. We can't all just wait for government to do it.
I'll add in, one of the bits of the question was around the sort of, the bias in large language models or in AI products and tools and so on. I think it's kind of two bits to that. And we know from things like facial recognition and from lots of work that's primarily tested on white middle class men like me, it works brilliantly for me. It does not work for other groups. So having teams that are much more diverse, having training data and so on that's much more diverse. That's kind of one thing about that. And you people in the room obviously know about that a lot. But I think maybe another interesting bit that's happening right now is that the systems we're seeing are kind of cutting edge, and they've come through into mainstream, sort of surfaced for all of us very recently, and they are very expensive to produce and to train. That is not going to be the case for very long, is kind of one take. So things like the Chinese model, DeepSeek, we're not quite sure how much was spent on training it, but significantly less. But over time, these models will become more commodity. And Liz has talked about training an LLM in her area on questions that are being asked in the local authority. So you've got that kind of, you can push back. So if there are things that are basically tech bro West Coast led, we should also be making sure that there are public service-led developments, commodity examples that are trained on what social care users and social care caseworkers and so on are asking and answering. So those sorts of training data sets. And that's a kind of big shift from how we've been able to use this in the past.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the talk. I have a few questions about the back-end thing. There are some problems associated with the cost. So building and continuously improving the models requires infrastructure, and people know how to do it. And what are the costs associated with it? And do they outweigh the current costs without AI? So what is generally the value per cost? And something connected, if I remember correctly, there was some talk about one of the models and how it was applied with the bereavement example. How do we catch the things falling outside of the current models that we are using? And with those models come questions about the data protection, and as you are building them on feedback from people actually using them.
Yeah, that's very much why there's a number of points there. The issues, it's a very dynamic space. I don't think, and of course there are serious questions about energy costs, and even none of these companies are profitable. My understanding at the moment is that they're getting about 30% revenue for every dollar they're spending. I think that that won't settle for a while. But I can't remember whose paradox it is, Jevons paradox? We know that sort of thing is going to apply. So even if the costs of compute goes down, the utility of these things is so high that they're going to be used very, very widely. And that's going to create significant problems for the United Kingdom. We don't have very renewable energy sources like maybe Norway or Finland or Sweden do. So I think there's a lot of questions there. And everything else you mentioned is, so if you look back at, for example, the history of my work, I've spent a decade looking at those type of problems, and that's why we sit down together. But there's no point in theorizing about those problems in a university thinking it looks like this. You have to sit down with people and work out the mechanics of that in deployment. So the answer would I think, vary according to deployment. But yes, all big issues.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I also had a question about the investment and kind of along the similar thread. When is it worth the proprietary effort to build a solution in-house versus getting a solution from somewhere else? For example, the Copilot, I'm sure a lot of employers have been adopting sort of a white label version of Copilot rather than try and build that solution themselves. But something like you mentioned about the comments for the visits and getting the comments on being able to ingest that and automate that in a better way, that was an in-house solution that you decided to invest in. What sorts of things go on when you're thinking about that?
I think there's a really simple answer for that for local government. I think, as Liz has said, there's lots of opportunity, yeah, but everyone's coming forward saying, we'll solve this individual problem. And there's about 1,000 use cases out there. The bigger thing is that local authorities are going to have to reorganise in the next 2 or 3 years. So there's really only point, I think, at the moment in investing in something that's going to have quite a quick payback. But I think there's the potential for lots of those. The issue is more, with any technological change, are all the staff going to adopt it, and are they going to use it well? So, I think we love the idea that there's this simple thing. It's in a black box. If we do it, it's going to solve our problems. I'm a glass half full person, but I do think the big challenges are on delivery and how you get whether it's corporates or the public sector to adopt this and do it well. The investment case is, that's our bread and butter for lots of things. So you'd have to take a view on each individual case. What's its payback period? I think at the moment, in 3 years' time, my council may not exist, Liz's council may not exist. So what's the point in adopting a solution that will take 5 years to pay back? But there is massive opportunity when you create a new council in 3 years to start with a new tech platform that doesn't have some of the legacy issues that we have. And I think you could do some really exciting things around data, around insights, around how you design public services, but they're led by people in the community, not by, as Neil said, by what providers say we'll provide this solution. It's got to start with real people in the community, what they want, rather than what's easy to buy off the shelf, I think, personally.
I was just going to say, there's also, in central government, there are various kind of guides or frameworks to procurement. So should you buy or build type stuff, which is essentially your question, and kind of the divide or the line between those things is a bit blurry, and it's the sorts of things that we just heard. But local government spends, I think, £3 billion per year on digital across a lot of things, from running all of the email systems to running frontline services, etc. But that's a lot of money collectively. So in terms of the kind of leverage and investment into changing things and developing new products and services, that's kind of a big interest and a big impact for, let's say, industry partners or people building tools. So I think the kind of other bit is that there's an opportunity cost to building stuff. So if you have, for example, one development team that can build something this term or this year, and they're occupied on this thing, is that the most highly valuable thing that they could be doing? Because you're not going to build loads and loads and loads of development product teams within a local authority, or even within probably a central government department. So there's that trade-off. So sometimes buying or procuring is going to be valuable, even if you could build it for slightly cheaper.
I just wanted to, I think it's a good question, but I don't think it is the priority question. I think much more of what we've heard Liz and Robert talk about are the priority questions. The truth is, if you look at both our corporate infrastructure and our government infrastructure, it's become more and more disconnected from the citizen/customer. And the problem we're going to face with these technologies, and what we see with a lot of the rhetoric we're hearing about it now, is people aren't looking to put that right. So if you look at the investigations into Horizon and Lorenzo, the National Programme for IT, which are both disastrous deployments of tech software, they share exactly the same problems. Failure to put in feedback cycles, engagement with the people who are deploying the technology, failure to listen to the problems as they were coming up, ignoring those issues. And it doesn't really matter whether it's a one-size-fits-all solution or a bespoke solution or who's building it. What matters, it might matter downstream, but the first thing you have to have in place is what is your mechanism for understanding success? And I have to say, being very excited by Pat McFadden's team in Cabinet Office. They have a whole test and learn framework. And if you want to search it up, just search test and learn UK government, and you'll see how they're trying to address that, which is about not deploy and forget, but constant monitoring of deployments. Because whatever decision Liz is choosing to make now, won't be the right decision in 5 years' time. But the point is, by South Cambridgeshire actually actively working in this area, they're building institutional capability that they will be able to make that right decision in 5 years' time.
Hi. Hello. I wanted to ask about how, on a local or central government level, you're measuring the environmental cost of these AI solutions? And are you comparing that to other solutions that aren't AI-based? And then how are you kind of justifying using that AI technology if the environmental cost is really high? So take, for instance, that kind of phone call AI answering thing you were describing. Have you measured the environmental cost of that and how that compares to having an actual human person answering the phone?
Well, the environmental cost of humans is very high, actually. So I'm pretty certain that an AI answering the phone is much lower than a human, but I don't think that that's where things go wrong. It tends to be that the amount of questions you can ask AI goes shooting up. I don't know what you're doing in government, but just to emphasize, it's to compare it to a human. We don't want to do that because actually we like humans, but Liz, I don't know how you...
So I'll be completely honest. We have not measured the environmental impact. Most of our energy is supplied from our own solar, and so in that sense, you know, our council prides itself on being a kind of environmentally minded council. But we've been doing this for 6 months, and it's one of the areas where, you know, we talk about it in our club, actually, like how are we going to approach the kind of cost benefit in terms of the environment? And we're not there.
Just from central government, it's a varied landscape. So some groups look a lot at that because that's one of the fundamental things that they're interested in. Others are, for example, so there's a Crown hosting organisation that basically runs data centres for government. Their pitch to departments and us is very much around we reduce energy costs, we reduce in overall running of these systems, so you should be moving to us. So there's definitely looking at how we're reducing energy and environmental impact. In terms of the kind of day-to-day sort of pilots and prototypes and so on, I suspect people aren't doing that much just in general, but there are definitely some places and some parts of government that do a lot of that.
It's the fear here, because I think we've got really low energy usage. We've looked at it, and we've got a carbon management plan, and the biggest thing is our buildings, then our fleet, and we've got plans to get to net zero. So our digital spend is tiny. You're right, it is something we're going to have to keep an eye on. But it's when I hear that some of the large AI companies in the US are starting to take stakes in mini nuclear reactors or considering buying 5 Mile Island, that you realise that there is this kind of arms race for compute power. Cambridge has got, is it DAME? Dawn. That's 1,000 GPUs. They're quite powerful, but Elon Musk has just put together 100,000 of the latest really energy-sapping GPUs to launch his AI and Grok. So it does feel like this issue is only going to get more and more of a concern, I think, and we've got to be really alive to it.
Yeah, you can imagine easily, like very significant proportions, like easily 10% of world electricity just being on running these computes. I think world electricity is about 2% of data centers at the moment, maybe slightly above that. I think, I haven't double checked, but I forecast this 10 years ago that it was going to overtake Africa, the percentage. So like, I think that's true, I haven't double checked, but roughly the rate it was going up, that the amount of electricity we're spending on data centers is larger than the whole of the continent of Africa uses. And you can easily imagine that shooting up to some very significant percent, and it's a major, major problem.
So we're going to come to a question here, then I'd like to queue up maybe 2 or 3 we could take in a group to round off. So if our great volunteers could help with that.
So one of the things with new technologies is quite often people take them and try to make them do things we already do better, which is a little bit, I think I like blue sky thinking. So it would be good to actually look at the city council issues and the council issues to see, one of the problems is in-house, you're always dealing with what you're doing with. And so it's a bit of a 2-part thing, really. Is it possible for the councils to join up with the university in a way that you offer a scholarship specifically for AI, for the betterment of Cambridge people, Cambridge? That might open up some blue sky thinking because they're not entrenched with the daily running of the council, but it may also offer greater connectivity on this. It doesn't have to be funded through the council tax. We could have what do you call it, funding, a community funding pot. I'd put in a £5.
Excellent, we'll take that.
Responses to this, and then we'll take a final round of questions.
We are actively thinking about that. I think the danger is that universities might be a bit too blue sky. So one of the things and Greenwich have something like this, is thinking about community interest companies, or a third place is interested where Liz is thinking is on this, where you've got a group of people who aren't worrying about publishing Nature magazine, like universities are incentivized to do. They're interested in, really, they care about the problems that local government are thinking, and they're thinking about these sort of 12, 18-month timeframes that are very hard in an operational business, and then they become a great interface for the university itself. So, and we don't think that's just true of local government, we think that's true across the board, that there's this missing third places of convening people together, caring about problems that may be panning out in the next 12, 18 months, hard for companies and organizations to do, but not really incentivized universities to do, because for a PhD student, they're having to worry about, how do I pass my thesis exam, which might require something that isn't useful in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, Neil and I have spoken, I said to Neil, send me a PhD student and I can just let them free in the council and they can find problems that are real world problems and help us solve them. And Neil said, no, those PhD students want to write their thesis and go and get a job somewhere. And fair enough. But exactly that sort of, I think if Robert and I had someone who would come and, sit alongside my colleagues and be an expert in helping them understand. Sometimes we don't even know what the problem is that we want to solve. That's how kind of new this stuff is to us. So I think it's a great idea, and I'm going to have a collection on the way out. So
my purse is open.
I'll just very quickly add in on that. Your first part of the question was around not having faster horses and not just doing what we currently do, but a bit faster, a bit better. I think some of the tools kind of give the opportunity to transform or reform what we do as well. And what I'm really interested in, say, how you can move to a bit more preventative, a bit more upstream, a bit more early support before things get out of hand too bad. And I think some of the data flows and some of the kind of advice and kind of inputs and signals for that are very interesting. And that idea about supporting local authorities and public services through things like, and linking up to the health service as well, I think that's very interesting. It's hard, it's sensitive. There are going to be some really kind of tough conversations to work through. But I think that's an area of possible transformation.
Thanks. Given what you've said about the challenges and opportunities, I just wondered what you felt the priorities should be for the delivery of skills and knowledge in schools with regard to AI in order to help really prepare young people for the workplace of the future.
Then I think we also have a question over here.
I think AI has a lot of promise for prioritization, but there was a comment earlier about using it for, it was something about planning documents and read the difficulty of pulling in 20,000 consultations and reading them, and how AI would help with that. To me, that sounded like summarization, and summarization is dangerous because you have to deal with the problem that fundamentally generative models don't know what truth is and don't know what facts are. So if you fed 20,000 models, 20,000 planning consultation responses into one of those, it would have forgotten the first 19,000 before it gave you any of the summaries, and the rest it would probably make up. I actually tested this yesterday. I asked I think it was ChatGPT, for a history of a project I started in 2019, and it gave me something that sounded totally plausible, except that I said I started it in 1951 and invented decades of complete not plausible sounding nonsense to fill up the gaps. If I hadn't started it myself, I might have been taken in. You can't trust what they say, but you can trust them to point you in the right direction, as it were. Prioritizing what humans look at makes sense. I think summarizing things so you can avoid reading what the humans have said is risky. I may be wrong, but...
But skills and trustworthiness.
Very briefly on the skills, I think region of learning, we're going to get a digital badge on AI for young people, And a young person did approach me and say, Robert, let's do a hackathon at the Guildhall. It could be over 4 days, loads of young people, loads of companies, and we could start and try and solve some of these problems or learn about AI, and we could get support from some experts and hopefully from some local companies that are really know what they're doing. So I'm going to try and pursue that. It may not be 4 days, but if we could do a day and bring in lots of young people into a civic space and get them engaged in this new technology, that could be really positive.
And, on education, so I think, I'm not sure if it's public yet, but I'm involved with the group AI in Education that's forming a charity, which I've agreed, if it is formed, to be a trustee of, because yes, it's absolutely vital. And I think it's another area where it's deeply worrying how we're not having a nationwide conversation about education. And I partially get it, because like universities are already struggling, despite this need to fill a new role. I mean, Cambridge is very lucky, but all universities are struggling and they're on the edge. Schools are struggling, teachers are struggling. And we really need to do exactly the same thing we're trying to do with councils, with teachers, to support them in how they support their students. And not only that, it's also a reformation of, continuing education in terms of people changing jobs and supporting them in assimilating these technologies. By the way, there is no money for doing this, right? So the only way we can do it, I think, is, and that's why local communities are so important, is to think about local communities and how, every town, city in this country needs a place that people can go and talk about this and learn about this from people who have some confidence or know who to ask. And the only way we can do that at scale is bottom up, actually, is by, for example, leading in Cambridge, coming up with examples and sharing very freely with other areas and regions what's working. And unless we do that, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. And like I say, there isn't billions of pounds to do this. And I don't think if someone were to spend billions of pounds on it, it would work. But it would work if people like yourselves are interested in getting engaged in it, interested in supporting these initiatives, interested in supporting the sort of thing that Robert just said around local hackathons. But knowing how to do that well then sort of becomes important. And on the trustworthiness point, yes, that's kind of why we work very closely with South Cambridgeshire, because there are all those issues, of course. But there's many, many things you can do for that, and the models are actually being fine-tuned for these specific cases. So it's not just throw ChatGPT at it, it's let's fine-tune. That work's being done in collaboration with the University of Liverpool. And, I don't know, Liz, if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised when I said to my colleagues, once we've built this large language model, can we share it with other authorities? And they said, no, absolutely not, Liz, because it's context specific. We built it for Greater Cambridge, and it uses our data, and we spent 9 months looking at the outputs and refining it. So it's not like we're just sticking 20,000 comments in ChatGPT. So hopefully we won't experience that problem. On the skills stuff, so I can't remember the skills, yeah. I think there's a bigger thing about skills. So, and just to give you one example, and this is kind of, I suppose it's nothing to do with AI, but I watch a lot of my colleagues in the office going like this. And when I'm asked what was the most useful thing I ever learned, I say touch typing. Yeah. And we are terrible in this country about learning stuff. We're terrible about learning how to use IT. When you think about, the stuff that you can do with basic Word, Excel kind of programs, we just don't know how to do it. And we don't train people to be more productive. And, it's, I suppose, a little bit scary to me that we're talking about how can we train people in AI when actually we haven't kind of got the basics right. But I do think, that's something that I suppose, as leaders in organisations, we're responsible for addressing those problems in our own organisations. And then, as Robert said, kind of going out into the community and supporting communities in the same way.
But the nice thing, if you'd had a touch typing club, I doubt you'd have got 100 people turning up. So it's a nice way to sort of, I think it's really interesting that people come for the excitement, but then a lot of it is actually they learn sort of simpler things.
There's a lot of exciting things about touch typing now.
I love touch typing too. I'm into it as well. But...
Of course, the irony now is that nobody needs to touch type, right? Because you.
Well, they do all that. I can't be watching kids do that.
Yeah,
It's
or you've just got sort of voice into whatever it's called. But the point is that whatever's relevant at the time, whatever the technology is at the time, we don't learn it well. And,
Well, in the spirit of creating spaces to further discuss the implications of these technologies and our hopes and fears about our future with AI, I wanted to flag that we have an event taking place tomorrow from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. at the Copper Kettle on King's Parade, where a collection of researchers and representatives from the council will be available to talk about how they're developing and deploying AI systems. So please join us for that event, because I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time for this panel this evening. I'd like to say a few words of thanks to the Cambridge Festival team for pulling this together, my colleagues Ellie and Annabelle for all the work they did to make this event happen, and to our colleagues at the Kavli Centre for Ethics, Science and the Public for pulling together tomorrow's Hopes and Fears Lab. Please join me in thanking our panel for their contributions.
Good.